Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. It's simply astonishing. New studies are showing that current smokers have a significantly lower risk of COVID-19 death than both never smokers and former smokers when you correct for other variables, including many of the health problems that smoking intensifies. The new science is in addition to several studies released early in the coronavirus pandemic, which showed a link between nicotine use and the prevention of COVID-19. What should vapers make of these startling new developments? Could the mantra, "Vaping Saves Lives," be extended to COVID-19? Could it be a delicious irony? Smoking saves lives. Joining us today to talk about this is Clive Bates, renowned international tobacco control expert and master of the counterfactual. Clive is going to walk us through the findings of the new studies and provide us his patented analysis of the potential impact on the bitter battle to ban the vape. Clive, thanks for coming back on the show.
Hi, Brent. It's great to be back.
Well, and it's great to see you. Now, first, I want to jump into COVID. We're going to get into teen vaping statistics. We're going to talk about the WHO and all of the research with regards to nicotine and smoking and vaping and all that kind of stuff. But first, you're in the UK. Tell us what's going on with COVID there. Is the lockdown still in full effect?
Yeah, I've been from Nigeria and in the UK for a couple of weeks. We're just at the moment in the process of easing some of the lockdown now and moving away from a relatively strict approach to a less strict approach, in the hope that this will cause the economy to start firing up again and get us back to some sort of normal life. Of course, the risk is that it doesn't do that. That what happens is that we get a second surge in COVID cases. There's a panic response. The healthcare system's under stress, and we go back. So nobody quite knows what is going to happen, but we've begun the process of lifting the restrictions.
Now, in terms of the response to the pandemic, obviously there's a lot of economic catastrophe that's already happened and more potentially to come. What's your thoughts on that in terms of the proportionality between that and the risk of the virus?
Well, I mean, the economic impact is just sort of unbelievably bad. And actually, the outlook is pretty terrible as well. I don't think there'll be a quick rebound back to sort of normal economic life as it was before the pandemic took hold. So we could be living with this for some time. Any health economist would have to question whether the cost in terms of avoided loss of life or the benefits in terms of avoided loss of life were proportionate to the overall economic damage. But what I think is driving this is not a cold-blooded calculation, what is the economic optimum, but a really strong sense that people don't want to see things like the healthcare system in total disarray. They're aware that people are at risk, but they don't want to see people dying in miserable conditions, in hospital car parks, in tents, on trolleys, and all the rest of it. So what's really driving the policy is the stability of the healthcare system. And that actually takes us into the issue of what is it that could reduce the rate of hospitalization. And you mentioned the studies in your introduction. The studies that we have are not suggesting that smoking or nicotine prevents you actually getting the disease in the first place, but more that it prevents the disease being so serious that you end up needing to be hospitalized. And that actually means that if there was a protective effect, and there is a huge if about that, then it's playing into the main issue with the disease is people ending up in hospital and then getting sick as a result of that.
So we've got a bunch of the research here posted up and stories about it. Why don't you walk us through from what you understand, Clive, in terms of what is the research? There's some stuff that was with regard to nicotine. There's some research out just about smoking. So what's your overall lay of the land there?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that, we've got to be clear there are different points in the progression. So there's, first of all, actually getting the disease in the first place. And the data on that is so terrible. Nobody really knows how many people have got it, what characteristics that they have. There doesn't seem to be a protective effect from smoking or nicotine associated with getting the disease in the first place. And it may actually be a risk factor. But then the question is, what happens with progression of the disease? Many people get the disease, they don't suffer severe symptoms, they recover. It's unpleasant. Certainly, no one really wants to have it. It's unpleasant, but it doesn't take them as far as hospitalization. And hospitalization is the key issue, because that's the thing that stresses the healthcare system. And what the research has shown is that smokers are strikingly underrepresented in the numbers of people who wind up in hospital in the first place. Okay. And that is where it looks as though there is possibly, and I have to emphasize possibly, some kind of protective effect, that the worst of the symptoms to the point where you need hospitalization is something that nicotine or smoking protects against. Then from there, once you're in hospitals, there's a range of serious things that can happen to you. For example, you go from a normal hospital bed, maybe with just being provided with oxygen, into an intensive care unit. And finally, if everything goes totally wrong, you end up dead. Once in hospital, there doesn't seem to be a protective effect from smoking or nicotine. In fact, the outlook, once you are hospitalized, for smokers, and particularly former smokers, is worse. Okay, so what you have is fewer people and fewer smokers entering hospital in the first place. But once they do, their outlook is worse, and they are more likely to go to intensive care and more likely to die. And one possible reason for that is that if nicotine has a protective effect, what happens when people go into hospital is that they're made to quit smoking. You go onto a respiratory ward, you have to stop smoking. And, basically at that point, the hospital may be withdrawing something that has a protective effect and leaving you exposed to the underlying vulnerabilities that come with being a smoker, which is challenge to the cardiovascular system and other aspects of stress that smoking-related disease causes. So you have to think of maybe two effects in competition with each other. The vulnerabilities caused by decades of exposure to smoke, and then a possible, and I stress possible, protective effect from current exposure to nicotine. Now, all of that would be, could be dismissed as wishful thinking based on terrible data, and the data is very weak. But it's also backed up by a series of papers that stress biologically plausible mechanisms by which nicotine could protect against the disease. And this is what I think is so interesting about it. Essentially, the most serious effects of the disease are not caused directly by the virus, but by the virus triggering an immune system overreaction. So it's not the virus that kills you, but the immune system response to the virus going into a kind of overdrive, that uncontrolled overdrive known as a cytokine storm that kills you. And there is reasonably good evidence that nicotine can help to suppress those cytokine immune system overreaction. And this has been going, this sort of anti-inflammatory effect that nicotine has could be the reason why nicotine protects against the more severe inflammatory symptoms that you get as COVID-19 advances to its more serious stages.
So let me understand this correctly, from the different parts of this. is that, say you are afflicted with coronavirus and you've got COVID-19, you're in the hospital. Could the suggestion be that actually if nicotine was administered, it could help?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in a sense, in hospital, you're doing something very bold. You're basically taking someone who is using nicotine, if they're a smoker, and you're making them quit. You are, as a matter of policy, removing something that is plausibly, not certainly, but plausibly protective against the more severe symptoms of the disease.
Right.
So if you're going to make people quit smoking, and there's good reasons to do that, I'm not calling for people to carry on smoking. For goodness sake, do that with nicotine replacement therapy or something like that that provides an alternative source of nicotine, so that these people aren't just denied something that has been protecting them and masking the underlying vulnerabilities that they have arising from decades of smoke exposure.
So here's where we hit that very delicious irony, because my one question is, let's say this was all works and it's proven to work. I would imagine, though, that public health would insist that nicotine would not be administered to anybody under 26, because, of course, the brain damage from the nicotine would outweigh the saving of the life over COVID, right?
Well, I think actually that is likely to be a very rare, honest. Nicotine replacement therapy in the UK is indicated for use in kids, from the age of 12 onwards, and obviously the number of people under 30 with severe COVID-19 symptoms is very low indeed.
True.
It's really a disease of kind of my age and over. I don't think that's going to be a material problem.
Sure. And of course, I'm being sarcastic as hell, as much as I possibly could be. For our audience, we do have a bit of an audio issue with Clive, and we try to get that sorted out, but it's just one of those things. It's across the pond and it's Skype, so just bear with. And he has his young child there as he's doing some caring.
If you're hearing or seeing anything weird, it's
super. So, and Clive, if I ask you to repeat something, it's because something important you said, which everything you say is important, but something that I may need you to repeat. Okay, so I'm channeling right now the, every vapor viewer that we have out there who's been watching this research come in. And at the first part of it, it was a bit startling, like, as I termed it, because, could this really be the case? And you're so used to seeing, disinformation science coming out from the opposite side. And then when this stuff comes out that seems too good to be true, we advocate that you can't just be skeptical of the science that goes against your position. You also need to be skeptical about the science that supports your position. And we definitely were skeptical into that end. And so let me kind of walk everybody through the kind of timeline here that we've got. And just let me dip back to our links page. This page, everybody, is up live on RegWatch. It's filed under 1992. That's where I file all of our show dates. But if you just search for 2020 show links, you'll find a list of them. And this is today's show links. When we do have them up, they're there. And everything we're talking about is here. So when it comes to the research, it's very interesting. So the negative news stories started coming out on March 6th, and that was with our good friend Stanton Glantz. Reduce your risk of serious lung disease caused by coronavirus by quitting smoking and vaping. Thanks, Stanton. Great advice. And then
that's half right. Look, I mean, the issue is for people who are smoking. Once you're in hospital and things are getting bad, then smoking is definitely not something you want to have done in the past. It does create underlying vulnerabilities, and it is a risk factor. The question is actually relates to nicotine, and you have to look at both of these things together. And that's where Glantz is wrong in saying you should give up vaping. You should not give up vaping if you're doing it, especially if you're doing it as an alternative to smoking. And what we should be doing at this time is encouraging smokers to quit in any way that they can. That will have fairly rapid benefits for them in terms of the cardiovascular system. And if they do that by vaping or by nicotine replacement therapy, then they will have retained the protective effect of nicotine, if there is one. If they carry on smoking, or if they try to give up vaping, they may be losing a nicotine protective effect. They may be going back to smoking. You've got to distinguish here between the risks associated with smoke and the possible associated with nicotine. I don't think anyone is suggesting that nicotine itself is a risk factor for COVID-19, just that smoking is. And that is why we always say in all aspects of harm reduction, you have to separate the smoke from the nicotine and think about them differently. And in this case, that couldn't be more true. So the advice to vapers is basically carry on vaping. You're not compromised here. I mean, if you want to give up, fine, but don't sweat it. But certainly don't go back to smoking. But what we most need to do is encourage smokers who are actually quite vulnerable, have these underlying vulnerables, to make a switch to not smoking. And if that means that they should take up vaping because that works for them, then so be it. The idea that everyone could just quit completely after people have been, dependent on nicotine and have been deeply entrenched in smoking and vaping for years or decades, it's just ridiculous. It's just not practical public health. What we have to do is give people practical, actionable advice, not a kind of hypothetical, well, wouldn't it be great if all nicotine disappeared off the face of the planet and then we wouldn't have any of these problems? Because the problem is that we would, and we would still have a large population with the residual underlying vulnerabilities arising from smoking.
And that is the case. I just love it when we talk about common sense and common ground and all that kind of stuff. But certainly we both know, and you certainly know, that the anti-vaping lobby does not seem to find common ground at all.
They have been out in force. I mean, it's really interesting watching this, Brent, to be honest. I mean, the question I would always put is, what would you add if nicotine turned out to have a protective effect for...
Clive, sorry, can I get you to start that again? We lost you at the question.
Okay, so the question I would put is, would they, or would you, would anyone be glad or sad if nicotine turned out to have a protective effect on COVID-19? Now, any sane person would be absolutely delighted. It's a cheap, abundant, widely available, readily made, accessible product. You can get NRT anywhere. You can get nicotine in non-combustible form anywhere. Game on. That would make a material difference to the progress of the disease. But I can't help thinking, looking at some of the comments I've seen, that there are people in the tobacco control world who would think this was the worst news they would ever have, that something good would be found to be said. And this has been going on for years. I mean, I don't know if you noticed this, but there was a paper out just a few days ago, and it was from the people who set up the doctors study in 1951. Okay, this is the huge 65-year study of British doctors, and it found, really beyond reasonable doubt, that smoking was protective for Parkinson's disease.
Wow.
Now,
wow.
You would think there would be huge news about this. I mean, Parkinson's is horrible. Nobody wants that. Yet it turns out to be protective. All the underlying science suggests that any protective mechanism is due to nicotine, and also any protective mechanism would be similar to the kind of mechanisms that we're talking about for protection against COVID-19. So you would think, this is great news. Nobody wants to talk about this. It's always been portrayed as a tobacco industry kind of, propaganda line or something. But the people doing this, these are the descendants of Sir Richard Doll and Sir Bradford Austin Hill. these are these are the giants of the tobacco. Sorry, I meant Sir Austin. These are the giants of the tobacco control world, of the original epidemiologists who discovered the links between smoking and cancer, and they found a protective effect on smoking and Parkinson's. There are other diseases where nicotine appears to have had a protective effect against severe respiratory conditions. For example, one form of Legionella disease. It's biologically plausible, but people don't want to hear it, or people in the tobacco control community don't want to hear it.
So what is going on? I mean, what is going on here? Because if it's just ideology, right? They're poisoned by ideology and they're not seeing it, or they're seeing it and there's some malevolence going on.
I think it's just adherence to almost a cult-like mentality about this. It's the war on drugs mindset that has to find these substances uniquely evil and the people using them uniquely problematic. It's so weird. It brings about the most weird unethical behavior. I mean, to try to shoot down this whole lot of argumentation about the underrepresentation of smokers and the possible protective biological effects of nicotine on against these immune system overreactions as some kind of tobacco industry conspiracy is basically insane. It's weird, in fact. Yet that is what they are doing, and it's sort of it's reminiscent of this really extreme sort of fanaticism that cannot deal with the ambiguity and subtlety that there is there in real life. It's a very extremist, fanatical position.
And it's true, and it's singular around the smoking and nicotine issue. I've got a quote of yours up here from a tweet you had. Tobacco control is a cult, a creepy, unworldly sect with an elaborate belief system, high priests and shamans, sacred texts, pathological hatreds, child exploitation, intolerance of dissent, nourished by billion-dollar funding and concealed by the ornamentation of respectability. Clive Bates.
Wow. I was obviously in a bad mood.
Well, you were in or potentially in a very eloquent mood. Now,
yeah.
I'm going to have to do this. Now, if this question is out of bounds, just let me know, because you don't need to answer this question. But when we're looking at public health takes a lot of control, right? I mean, it assumes a lot of authority. Sometimes, I mean, in most cases, the assumption of that authority has been granted to it by year after year, event after event, legislation after legislation, and so forth. It's not like public health is in the Constitution of the United States. It's not like it's directly linked in, in the Charter in Canada and so forth. So they have an enormous amount of power over top of the entire mechanisms of the legislature, of the economics, government, and of course, over individuals' liberty. And nowhere is there an accountability structure or anything like that. And so when this thing rolls out, it's very difficult to not see it as being very totalitarian-like. And with regard to their position on things like nicotine, the intransigence that they have, that also points to a totalism in the way that they think. So if their behavior is totalitarian in nature and their thinking has become total, and so their approach to science is totalism, so it's become just one way of seeing science, and it's that way or the highway, then that's fascism. And then as soon as you have fascism, you look and go, oh, wait a minute, the one key fascist, government that we know about was insane about hygiene, insane over tobacco, insane over nicotine. So there is an exact, corollary here to National Socialism.
I think you're letting governments off the hook there with that, Brent, to be honest. these bodies are mostly publicly funded. They have chief executives and boards that are appointed by the public sector. They're mostly accountable to parliaments or Congress in the United States. The issue is that they seem to be able to form political coalitions to get their way, and they seem to be able to do that by misusing and abusing public money for science to create stories and narratives that politicians feel very, but I don't care about that. I think it's up to politicians to be more skeptical, to hold them to account, to challenge them. And I don't mean politicians doing this alone. I mean, governments have extensive networks of civil servants and so on who should be doing this, not to just be spoon-fed sort of ideologically driven nonsense. I just don't think, you can allow that to happen. I mean, in these totalitarian states, and you mentioned National Socialism in Germany, that was the government. That was the government doing that. So to me, this is really about legislators, the executive officials holding these agencies, people within them, to greater account, and they've not been doing that very successfully.
Not very successfully at all. So on that point, Clive, sorry, did you need a second there? You good?
No, it's okay.
Okay. So on that point, let's go straight then to the granddaddy of them all. Because if we're talking government, we've got, the extrajudicial, global, I don't even know what the heck to call it. But I mean, obviously, we're talking about the World Health Organization here. And so let's step back now in our little bit of a fun in 2020. So before the pandemic was at all on the radar of the average citizen in the West, and had already been talked about a little bit, on news and stuff like that, but not much. We're looking at, this is curated on January 29th, but it was an actual January 20th when the WHO had released, this was their e-cigarettes. Oh, it is January 29th. I think it's updated on 29th. You know the story here because you were part of one of the reasons why you kicked back. So they posted their statement on e-cigarettes on January 20th, and there was quite a bit of pushback. On the 21st, this was the WHO tweeted out this. Look at this. This is on January 21st. E-cigarettes, how risky are they? E-cigarettes.
Yeah, I remember this. I mean, this is completely irresponsible. It's terrible. I mean, almost everything they said was wrong, factually incorrect, scientifically suspect, or a non sequitur. They made a huge fuss about the EVALI thing, the lung injury episodes in the United States, which, I think most informed observers knew was nothing to do with nicotine from last year onwards, yet it was appearing in WHO material as if it was a material concern about electronic nicotine delivery systems and e-cigarettes. Whether that was deliberate, conflation of the EVALI THC vitamin E acetate story with nicotine vaping, or whether it was just mere incompetence and the sort of lags between WHO understanding things and new knowledge actually being created, I don't know. I suspect they were looking for whatever bad things that they could find, and they were trying to throw whatever they could find, plus the kitchen sink at nicotine vaping, in this absurd tweet storm plus question and answer, which they had to take down within a couple of days because it was even too ridiculous for them.
And I mean, what would motivate them? I mean, we had Chris Snowden on the show early April, and he had really, lashed out at them because was this a diversionary tactic maybe? Because this is right at the heart of the time. If you look at the timeline, this is at the heart of the time when they should have been warning the world about the pandemic, but they weren't. And now
Well,
now we're finding out that according to reporting out of Germany, from the top paper there, I'm not going to try to butcher the name, but the top daily Der Spiegel or whatever that is, it just came out earlier in the week and reported fully that China had asked the WHO to not label as a pandemic, to not tell anybody. And so this is the same time here when the WHO is launching this, is when they were cooling their heels on behalf of China's request.
Well, I haven't got the timetable to hand, but what I recall is the. Hang on a second. Just hold on a second.
No problem.
Hi, I'm back.
Good to go.
All right, good. Yeah, I mean, as I think, if I'm not mistaken, this Q&A came out around the end of January. 20th of January, and then 29th of January was the update. And I think WHO first called the pandemic on the 31st of January from memory.
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
Same time. I think it's worth just understanding how these organizations work. There's a little team stuck in WHO called the Tobacco Free Initiative. It's tiny compared to WHO and compared to the Convention Secretariat for the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is where most of the bad stuff comes from. These people will not have been involved in anything to do with the coronavirus pandemic as it was building up. That will have been a completely separate branch of WHO. Now, so I don't think there's any linkage between the two. I don't think it's diversionary. I think it's just good old-fashioned useless incompetence happening in parallel. Clive,
just 1 second.
Yeah.
I'm astonished myself how many posts are here. I'm like, when is this going to stop? I'm still scrolling from the top.
Yeah, no, it's ludicrous. I mean, they've put their entire Q&A into a tweet storm, and it's honestly just all of it was just rubbish. I mean, there wasn't really anything in it you could find that was actually factually based. I mean, I wrote to the guy who did this, who's responsible for it, afterwards and said, look, obviously this is embarrassing for you. Nick, would you like to do? Yeah. So I did this critique. After I did that, I said, look, it's obviously embarrassing and humiliation. Would you, on the next round, would you at least like to talk about it before you publish something? And that way, at least you could get, a contrary view. And if you're going to take critical positions, you can at least go in with your eye open. But I didn't even get a report. I didn't say what I was thinking, put it that way. But I did write to them politely, asking to see if they would take a second view. But that's partly why I think it's a crazy cult. I just don't think, normally, if somebody had criticism that they've seen on my blog, they would say, okay, well, maybe we ought to talk to you, and maybe we ought to try and find a sensible way through this and at least get your opinion before we publish it again. But I don't think that's what they're interested in doing. They're not interested in telling the truth about vaping. They're interested in telling a story about vaping that is, unalloyed hostility. And they're doing that because they're pursuing a war on drugs cultish mindset about nicotine.
Yeah, and that's strange because, of course, that's at the same time that the total softening up on cannabis is happening everywhere in the West. But and it's really public health that's done that softening. And it's,
exactly.
And so that's what's mind-blowing. I always come down to it as say, we'll never trust a government that prefers their citizens to be stoned. And the problem is that nicotine actually makes you sharp and think and get stuff done. Pot, makes you think, but about getting the next bag of Doritos, that's the thing, right?
But I think, people, again, they sort of misunderstand WHO. I mean, WHO is managed by its members. There's the World Health Assembly and there's the executive board of the WHO, and those are the countries that are part of it. And a lot of the WHO's problems stem from two things, really. Inadequate sort of direction from the governance structures of WHO, an inadequate challenge to the sort of stuff that they're doing on tobacco, and also inadequate funding. I mean, the numbers to hand, but it's sort of, I think it's sort of in excess of 60, 70% of its money comes through so-called voluntary contributions. And really, everybody is in on that. Little bits of funding from here, there, and everywhere. Could be pharmaceutical companies. There's lots of Bloomberg money swilling around in WHO, and Bloomberg is, you know, a self-confessed prohibitionist when it comes to vaping. Unsurprisingly, WHO is dancing to that particular tune because, you know, he's the piper and, you know, he's paying. So you know, you've got to get the funding sorted out. You've got to get the governance sorted out. But that's the responsibility of the member states, the parties, the countries to do that, to be clear what they want, not to put up with any nonsense that's coming out of them. Not a single member state can say, but they should have done. They should all have been incensed because it's self-evidently rubbish. So WHO continues to do these things because it's unchallenged by its own governance structure. And then it's underfunded, so it's in hock to all kinds of interests who aren't necessarily the interests of the member states and the wider public, as represented by the member states.
And that's a good point, Clive. And I've got up here right now, as we're walking people through now, the timeline still, again, here's March 24th. And so we had the end of January, they came out with it. There was a big, huge blast from you folks and stuff. They had to backtrack a bit. And then COVID goes into full bloom and crisis. And then here we are on March 24th. This is after the first little bit of French studies had come out with regard to nicotine and smoking, and that those first studies were coming out saying, hey, just people that are coming in and we know that there's not as many smokers, and that kind of, this is all strange. And so here the WHO came out on the 24th and wanted to make some things clear. Are smokers and tobacco users at higher risk of COVID-19? And I'll just take you off the shot here. So you can have there you go. And so smokers are likely to be more vulnerable to COVID-19 as the act of smoking means that fingers and possibly contaminated cigarettes are in contact with lips, which increases the possibility of transmission of virus from hand to mouth. Smokers may also already have lung disease or reduced lung capacity, which would greatly increase risk of serious illness. It just seems silly to me.
Yeah, I mean, what they're doing there is they're saying things that seem plausible. You know, you can imagine somebody, oh, I can see how that works, or you know, you can imagine that smoke carries virus particles, or vaping carries virus particles, therefore increases transmission. So all of these things sound reasonable. There's no evidence really to draw on. They're just saying those things because they might, and you'll find that all of that language is qualified by mights and maybes and potentiallys and so on. And those things are all right. You know, they are potentially things. They are realistic things. But what they're not doing is picking up on the things that work against that hostile narrative. And what they want to do is have a hostile narrative. And that's governing what they say about this. It's not really making them think about what is the public health optimum thing to call for. You know, and as I say, I think that is to, you know, try to encourage people to stop smoking. But can you know, hell will freeze over before WHO says something like that.
Oh, I'm going to get you. You're going to have to re-say that last little bit before hell freezes over, because we lost you there. So if you could just pick that up for me, Clive.
Okay, I think, you know, I think the right advice is that people should give up smoking, you know, with respect to COVID-19, to reduce their underlying vulnerabilities and improve their long-term outlook. But they should maintain use of nicotine, at least until we know in greater detail what effect nicotine is having, protective or otherwise, with respect to COVID-19. That would be, in my view, that's a proper implementation of the precautionary principle, which is, that you when you don't know whether something is, when you don't know whether there's a protective effect or not, what you do is you make an assumption and then consider what the consequence of being wrong would be. So I assume there's no protective effect, and there is, and I advise people to quit smoking, then I potentially put them in a life-threatening position. Or quit nicotine, they're in a life-threatening position. If I advise people to continue using nicotine, but there's no protective effect, what have I done? Somebody's used a nicotine patch. Big deal. People do that all the time. It's not the end of the world. So the consequences are very asymmetric when it comes to being wrong about making assumptions under conditions of uncertainty. And that's how a policymaker should think about this, is always when things are uncertain to ask the question, okay, I'll make an assumption, but what if I'm wrong? What are the consequences of that? And that would incline you to use nicotine on a precautionary basis in these situations.
Yeah, I mean, and what you're describing is of course, doing a comparative analysis of alternatives. And so there's multiple alternatives to actions that can be taken, and compare and contrast, look at intended and unintended consequences, and then make an informed decision based on that. And then, and tack as you go and change as you go. But that's not the case here. When you're consumed by ideological thinking, you are actually prevented from doing comparative analysis of potential alternatives. You just don't see the other alternative.
I think this is knowledge they would rather not have, some of them. I mean, don't want to paint with an excessively broad brush, because there's a lot of public health people who do want to see this. But there is an entrenched tobacco control community for whom this would be terrible news, however absurd and unethical that is. Nicotine saves thousands of lives through protective effects on COVID-19. How could that be bad news? But for some people, it would be.
Oh my God, it's terrifying. So we're doing good for time, and we're going to be switching over to the other topics that I want to get to as we bring it into the teen vaping and stuff. But we have an important close to do on this. So let me just jump us back over to our little hosting page here. And so what we've got labeled here is, COVID vaping nicotine positives. These are the studies that have come out in some of the news articles, and here's Clive's plausible hypothesis that nicotine is protective against more severe COVID-19 symptoms. So you can get that here. And again, the French scientists, why are smokers being hospitalized less often than coronavirus? That was, very good piece, in April. Then we have in May here, as May starts to come up, we start getting hit with some really big information that made me go, wait a minute. This research clearly is starting to show that this is more than just, wishful thinking. May 1st, smokers seem less likely than non-smokers to fall ill with COVID-19. Where there's smoke, the cigarettes and COVID story is growing harder to ignore. This was 2 days ago. And this was the National Post in Canada, our national newspaper. And it got syndicated out to, and I'm going to hand this to you in a sec here. This got syndicated out to The Guardian and everything else through The Wire. So this was a major piece. This is what we said, wait a minute. We're looking at, for smokers to do better in any health measure taken from any sample in any situation is astonishing. But now we have 2 studies showing that smokers do better with COVID. Clive, this was the National Health Service Electronic Health Records study, 17 million people. Fill us in on this research. How important is this?
It is quite important, but I think the conclusions of that, there's been a lot of discussion about how reliable those are. What happens if you adjust for age, and so on. I think that it's consistent. Again, the position is subtle. Okay, it's protective. It seems to be protective, or smokers seem to be underrepresented when it comes to hospitalization. But once hospitalized, smoking is a risk factor. In other words, the outlooks are worse, partly because people are required to quit smoking. So I think, I think that study adds, but it doesn't add particularly strongly to what we already have seen.
Okay, fair enough. And then based on that, then that's excellent to know. Timing wise, let me just find this here. Sorry, that's my fault here. So then timing wise, WHO on the very same day, so 2 days ago, came out with a statement, of course, which you would assume they would have to make. So WHO statement, tobacco use and COVID-19. Tobacco kills more than 8 million people globally every year. More than 7 million of these deaths are from direct tobacco use, and around 1.2 million are due to non-smokers being exposed to secondhand smoke. Key thing here, let me go through this. Tobacco smoking is a known risk factor for many respiratory infections and increases the severity of respiratory diseases. A review of studies by public health experts convened by WHO on the 29th of April, which we've talked about, found that smokers are more likely to develop severe disease with COVID-19 compared to non-smokers. So that's a develop. I guess that's what you're saying, right? COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, some of these statements that they made are right, but misleading. Yeah, once you're in hospital, there does seem to be an elevated risk that you're going to go on and suffer more severe symptoms and possibly die. That doesn't answer the question, and there's been a range of studies that show that is that once in hospital, smokers have a worse outlook. The issue is whether fewer smokers actually end up in hospital because of these protective effects. And of course, the moment you get in hospital, you are required to quit smoking. No one's allowed to smoke on a respiratory ward. So if you were getting a protective effect from nicotine that was masking some of the underlying vulnerabilities, then boom, that's gone. And you're back to having the underlying vulnerabilities. Now that is a more subtle narrative about this than WHO has conveyed in this communication. And in some ways, I can see their point, because this protective effect is not established. It's not clear whether the data really supports it, whether there are other explanations for the data, whether this is really a thing. So I think in that communication, they said there is insufficient evidence or something of that sort. There's not enough evidence to show a protective effect. That, again, is a true statement, but potentially misleading, because it's not as if there's no evidence. It's just that the evidence is not so strong that it's conclusive.
True.
So therefore, we can't say beyond reasonable doubt there is a protective effect.
So let me add.
They are navigating a path through the uncertainties in a way that creates a hostile narrative about smoking and vaping.
Yes.
Than they are letting on.
Yes. I know when we're losing your audio, you don't. So if you're going, but that's okay. We get what we get. It's been fine for the most part, but just the way Skype works, it always happens like right when you're saying the best thing. Those damn, okay. Let me bring up this. This is in the statement though. So let me find the right part here. Okay, so they say smoking impairs lung function, making it harder for the body to fight off coronaviruses and other diseases. Tobacco is also a major risk factor for non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease, cancer, respiratory disease, and diabetes, which put people with these conditions at higher risk for developing severe illness when affected by COVID-19. Available research suggests that smokers are at a higher risk of developing severe disease and death. Okay, fair enough. Who is constantly evaluating new research, including research that examines the link between tobacco use, nicotine use, and COVID-19? WHO urges researchers, scientists, and the media to be cautious about amplifying unproven claims that tobacco or nicotine could reduce the risk of COVID-19. Now, if they would only say that about every other piece of research that's out there, and they said there is currently insufficient information to confirm any link between tobacco or nicotine in the prevention of or treatment of COVID-19. So here's the deal. They're saying that absolutely unequivocally that vaping is more dangerous than smoking. That's their position. That's WHO's position and almost the position of most of the public health organizations, except for, say, ones that you're very...
Vaping is more dangerous than smoking?
Well, really? Yeah. Well, one of their slides did on January 21st, where they asked the question, is vaping more dangerous than smoking?
Okay. They didn't say that in that statement.
So you just cut out the
presentation they did in the Philippines.
The totality of WHO's narrative is one, as you said, is hostile to vaping. Part of the hostile to vaping narrative is that vaping is as dangerous or more dangerous than smoking. I mean, that's the end all be all of what's happened from all of the propaganda.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. And so they know that. So here they're presented from valid researchers doing great research, and they're saying, hey, there's something happening here that we think that we can put our name on it, that should be looked at, that we're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. What does WHO say? WHO says that's snake oil. Research on COVID and nicotine is snake oil, and admonishes the researchers, the scientists, and the media for at all even carrying the story. So where does that leave you, WHO? Well, because you're not recommending vaping, so stay smoking, or like it really is treachery.
I mean, those are the probably unintended consequences of having that kind of narrative. You don't get people who could quit smoking. They don't quit because they've been scared off the alternatives that would work for them. And that's the trouble with all the public health anti-vaping narrative. You terrify people about vaping, they carry on smoking. It shouldn't be that difficult to understand, but it seems to be. And if you've worked yourself up into such a state of anguish about vaping and nicotine that you think it's just as bad, well, why should you care if people carry on smoking and don't switch to vaping if you think it's just as bad? So they've talked themselves into an absurd, anti-scientific, unethical corner, in my view, by saying these sort of things. I mean, I thought there's was certainly said true things, but in a misleading way. It's true that there's insufficient evidence to establish a protective effect, but that doesn't mean there's no evidence, or that you should ignore it, or that you should dismiss it all as a tobacco industry scam or some sort of unscrupulous play. I mean, the people who are behind this are top-notch researchers who really understand what they're talking about.
Of course.
And it's very important. If there was a protective effect, it would be an amazing major breakthrough.
Totally.
And, just being, excited and motivated to look into that is entirely reasonable part of the scientific process. And the idea that people only do things because they're manipulated by the tobacco industry is just ridiculous. It's like from, some sort of Toy Town campaigning organization.
And I'm just waiting for your audio to catch up to you. We just lost you. So Clive, let me just jump us over now to a topic change. And here's an article we have curated to RegWatch. Higher nicotine content in Canada compared with UK is blamed for rising use. So new research reveals vaping among Canadian youth has risen dramatically over the past 2 years, and experts say it shows no sign of slowing down unless stricter regulations are put in place immediately. A survey of more than 12,000 Canadians aged 16 to 19, done in 3 groups between 2017 and 2019, found that the number of those who reported vaping in the previous month had more than doubled to 17.8% from 8.4% in 2017. And the results were published in JAMA, and this is our great friend, Dr. David Hammond's work. So what can you tell us about that?
I mean, we this research. I mean, the question. I mean, I don't doubt the specific statistics that he's quoted. I mean, he's a high quality researcher, very well regarded, and knows what he's doing. The question is whether they've got the analytical framing of this correct. And I've said this before, I think on your program, you need to look at these youth vaping epidemic figures in a particular way. First of all, you need to work out who is a frequent user and who is an infrequent user. The infrequent users, basically, you should not be worried too much about that. That's just kids messing around, blowing big clouds at parties, being silly, being kids. It's not something that you should be losing sleep over. In the grand scheme of, risk behaviors, it's far from the worst thing that a teenager could be doing, very far from. Then you should look at the more frequent users, and you should be analyzing how many of them were prior tobacco users or prior smokers, because, in a different world, they would have been smokers with, if there was no vaping available. And again, what you see is a different picture to the one that comes out in the dominant narrative. What you find is that the frequent users, the people who are using it daily or more often, are the ones who were smokers or would otherwise have been smokers. So for them, it's potentially beneficial. And then you should be kind of looking closely at what's happening with smoking behavior. You can't have a discussion about youth vaping without coupling it to a discussion about youth smoking. And what we found in the Canada data is that Canada is doing reducing smoking. And
yeah, I lost you there. Clive, sorry to interrupt. I do need you to start that again. In Canada, we found.
Well, in Canada, we found that Canada was doing very well on reducing youth smoking. So both Canada and the US have had dramatic declines in youth smoking. We have a lower level of youth vaping in the UK, but relatively speaking, the smoking rates are higher. So which is the best situation? Okay, it's better to have lower youth smoking rates. And again, we have to come round to get back to the idea that we have to judge this alongside all the other risks that young people take. Smoking is one, drugs are one, violence, sex, drink driving, binge drinking, fighting, all of these things pose risks to young people far more serious than a vape. And again, there's been a big industry has been generated to create hysteria and a moral panic around nicotine use that really isn't warranted by the risks it causes. We set up the whole tobacco control world, the whole anti-smoking world, because we're worried about cancer, heart disease, and respiratory illness. Those worries are, if they're there at all, are greatly diminished when it comes to vaping. So we need a sense of perspective here. Most people are infrequent users and their use is frivolous, doesn't really matter. The more frequent users are likely to be or have been smokers, and potentially that's beneficial for them. And then overall, vaping just isn't that bad. So yeah, it's not a problem. It's not something you necessarily want kids doing, but for goodness sake, let's not lose our minds over it.
Well, and that is fantastic advice. I've got this we're obviously the whole concept of the fact that there was this epidemic and that teens, are vaping in large numbers. However that manifests itself, the fact is that the reality is the narrative in so many cases. And what we know about the media and the way things work is that the reality is filtered to fit a vision. And the vision is one in which that nicotine's bad, vaping's bad, teens are addicted, and it's a horrible, horrible thing. Two things. One, esoterically, and then we're going to jump into the discussion in terms of Canada and the nicotine cap. But this is a side one. We have just had now 2.5 months, and it could be more, right, where all of these teens have been locked into their house with their parents. And God only knows that parental responsibility, the lack of it, was probably one of the reasons why there were so many of these kids who were vaping. So do we have a problem in Canada and the US where there's millions of kids jonesing out on their nicotine withdrawal? Their brains are shivering and they're coughing and flu and shivering, because it's as bad as heroin. Like, I'm just wondering, would not the realities of a teen epidemic of nicotine addiction be either shown itself so drastically that there'd be news stories on it? Why are there no news stories from the mainstream media talking about these kids that are curled up on their beds, unable to do anything because they're jonesing and they're not getting their nicotine as their parents are hovering over the bed, keeping Jules away from them? Oh, wait a minute. It's not really a problem.
Yeah,
I get
that's the answer. I mean, it isn't the problem that people think it is. There are very few teenage vapers that show. I mean, I'm going off American, not Canadian data now, but it's more or less the same sort of thing. There are very few teen vapers that show signs other than those who were already dependent on cigarette smoking. So if you were seeing this, you'd be seeing withdrawal symptoms, not from most people, it just wouldn't bother them. If you're using something once every few days, you're not going to go into some, kind of crazy withdrawal symptom. You're not going to be like an extra in the French Connection. It's going to be, it's going to be nothing. It's going to be annoying because you basically want to hang out with your friends and kind of mess around with vapes. It's not going to be a big physiological challenge. Possibly if you're addicted to smoking, or you've become addicted to vaping because you're already a smoker, dependent on vaping, to use the better terminology, then yeah, maybe you've got a few problems that you have to deal with by being in the house. But that the same if you're a smoker. I honestly think there's just a missing sense of perspective about this. Imagine if we treated alcohol this way. I mean, again, I don't know what the numbers were in Hammond's study or whether he reported them, but about 30% of kids are drinking alcohol in the US every month. Do we go into some massive meltdown about that? No, of course we don't. Where we should do is if they're heavy users, they're getting in cars, they're driving into lampposts, they're getting into fights, they're becoming vulnerable to sexual attack or whatever. That's a real problem. Let's talk about the real problems that afflict young people. Let's talk about the mental health problems. Let's talk about bullying. Let's talk about violence in schools. Let's talk about the opioid crisis, for goodness sake. That's claiming thousand in a really nasty. And we seem to have a vast wall of money chasing something that is essentially, relatively speaking, a non-problem.
Well, and now on top of everything, we really should be talking about how we've completely spent all of the money for the children that they're ever going to have. So every child that we've got living, every grandchild and everything else is going to be saddled with the trillions of dollars of debt from coronavirus. I mean, it's really they're the ones that are going to be impacted. So maybe we should be talking about that.
Coronavirus, the economics of it, amount to a gigantic intergenerational transfer. I mean, that's true. Essentially we're taking, the younger people are taking a gigantic economic hit, both in terms of debt and lost opportunity, broken businesses and so on, in order to protect what is essentially a vulnerable, largely older population.
Right.
Decision you make in society, but it doesn't stop it being big intergenerational transfer.
It's still intergenerational transfer. So one last topic and then we'll wrap. And so this is still on the nicotine and teens, because in Canada, so the Canadian Vaping Association, representing, obviously the open system segment of the vaping market here in Canada and been doing it well for many years. We obviously are close with the CVA and they've been supporters of ours in the past. So is VITA and others too as well. We don't really pick sides when it comes to the vaping organizations. We're happy to cover. But this particular issue, though, is one that we've pushed back on because it's this, they made a decision, and I can understand what the decision was, is that in the height of this regulatory madness and hysteria over teen vaping late last spring, which was an opportunity to borrow from the UK TPD model of the 20 milligram cap, which at the time, though, wasn't salts. That was for, the organic, which is the standard regular e-juice. So there's some difference between, the nicotine cap when it comes to the two different kinds of e-liquids. Nevertheless, they made a call that it was the thing to offer Health Canada, which would demonstrate that the industry was serious about solving the teen vaping issue and believe that it actually would really solve it.
Yeah.
And so here we are now a year later, and all those regulations are not done yet. The controversy is still there because, of course, the body part orgs, cancer and all those guys are still pushing. They have enormous control and power and influence. And so once the Hammond's research came out, the Canadian Vaping Association, as you know, posted out a tweet and some press release material and stuff saying, hey, look, the CVA has called for the federal government to limit nicotine concentrations to 20 milligrams per milliliter. The rise in youth vaping rates in Canada directly correlates to the entrance of big tobacco vape brands such as Juul. And as you know, this particular time, because this is not new in terms of the Canadian scene, really unlocked quite a bit of unease amongst folks out there, and including you had some comments on it. So what do you think of this, Clive? And what's your take on it?
Look, I think it's a terrible idea. I understand trying to do it, and there's sort of think they're trying to sort of negotiate. But the history of these things is if you making concessions, especially concessions that aren't really based on anything. There's no real evidence that says that the main reason why there's an increase in youth use is due to high nicotine type products. Just that isn't an established thing. To the extent that there's science about it, it's more to do with the environment and interest and curiosity being generated into these products. We also know that people get the nicotine they want from a device. They don't get the nicotine that the device gives them. I also think these sort of ideas predate the design of things like Juul, which, although it has high-strength nicotine, it uses very low volumes of liquid, because what it's trying to do is deliver a certain quantity of nicotine in a low volume of liquid, because it has a small battery. And it has a small battery because it's trying to create a compact size. Small battery can't heat up large volumes of liquid, can't exert a lot of rapid power and get a rapid temperature increase unless the volumes are low. So the high nicotine is integral to the design. It doesn't mean that smokers are getting more nicotine. It means they're getting nicotine from a smaller volume of liquid. And then the salts have been used to mask some of the harshness and change the way that the nicotine is delivered via the lung. So there's a winning formula built into these products, and I accept that's uncomfortable for some of the vape shop and the vape manufacturers. But Juul has been spectacularly successful with adults. We keep having to come back to this. It's been massively successful with adults because it's got a kind of secret sauce. It has similar nicotine delivery to a cigarette, but it's in a compact form and it's convenient and easy to use. You don't need a degree in engineering to figure out, what to do with coils and wicks and, atomizers and all this sort of stuff. It's very much a play time. So the vaping aficionados don't, that's not their thing. That's fine. They don't have to be into that. But if you're trying to get the mass market, millions of cigarette smokers to make the first move into vaping, then the very first product you try has to be easy to use, look okay, and deliver something equivalent to a cigarette. And that is what these products have been able to do. And they create an entry into the vaping market, which creates a feed of people who are interested in vaping. And if they really develop their interest, they'll end up in the vape shops, talking to the owners, using these much more sophisticated products, using a wider range of flavors and so on. But if you don't get the vapors, if you don't get the smokers to convert in the first place, then you're not going to get such a large population of vapors that we all hope we'll get. And I'm very much in the camp of, if these products are successful with smoking, by the million in the United States and elsewhere, then what on earth is a vaping association doing trying to ban them? What happened to the primacy of the consumer? What happened to helping people get the products that work for them, not just the products that they sell or they think are best? And I know these comments will make me unpopular, but I'm very much in the camp that says, you've got to try everything. You've got to have everything available. There's not one right way to stop smoking. So if it's, a product like heated tobacco products, smokeless tobacco products, snus, these new white nicotine products like Zyn or whatever, or On, fine. If that's what people want to use, fair play to them, use it. But we shouldn't be having people on the tobacco harm reduction, vaping, public health side saying, no, the right way, life is this way, use these particular types of mods or whatever, use the products that we're making because that's the only way to do it. You've got to have a much more pluralistic view of the way this entire broad category is going to compete with cigarettes and ultimately obsolete that category.
And it all comes down to, in my mind, destigmatizing nicotine. And the missed call here was years ago, not fighting for recreational nicotine as a thing. If the narrative had been recreational nicotine, then there would be some battle to fight on. But it's never been fought on that in that manner. So
it's one of the reasons, to be honest, this is a sort of trade secret I'm going to let out now, Brent. I don't really like the term tobacco harm reduction because it's built into it is a kind of premise that everyone's smoking and we need to reduce harm. Whereas I would start almost from the bottom up and say, do we accept that nicotine is a legitimate, legal lifestyle drug in the same category as alcohol, caffeine, and a few other substances that is widely available in society? It's relatively innocuous, doesn't cause lots of sort of distress, violence, family breakdown or anything like that. If we think that nicotine is and will remain a legal recreational drug in society, then the question is how best to provide it in a way that is safe. And that's sort of like harm reduction, but it's different in a way. Because you'll find that some of the people involved in harm reduction talk about e-cigarettes as a kind of necessary evil to do away with the harms associated with smoking. We'll get onto the serious payment of nicotine. I don't see it that way. I see nicotine as a legitimate lifestyle drug that is likely to remain legal for the foreseeable future, should remain legal. And the challenge is, how do you provide it to consumers in a way that they can enjoy it without getting the horrors of cancer and heart disease and so on, or at least a level of risk that is commensurate with the risk appetite that we generally have for consumption and risky activities in society.
And you and I see eye to eye. We've mentioned that on this show a lot, even more recently when it comes to tobacco harm reduction. So I agree with you. Just give me 1 second here, and just to remind everybody that we do absolutely need your support from the industry, whether you're a viewer, vape shop worker, somebody who works in e-juice company or an e-juice company. It would be awesome if you went over to support.regulatorwatch.com. That is our support microsite at support.regulatorwatch.com. And give us a hand. Obviously, we promote fact-based science. We counter misperceptions on vaping. Destigmatize nicotine is critical. And of course, we hold researchers, regulators, and reporters to account. Very simple form. You can do a one-time donation or reoccurring monthly. If you've got US dollars, they go a long way in Canada. That would be fantastic if you could get a chance to toss a few dollars our way. We have also brought on some producing help. Mr. Producer is listening in right now, and you've seen that there's been a dramatic increase in our content, and we're going to be pushing more and more out, hopefully to have an impact somehow on the election debate. So, Clive, my last question for you here is this. Okay, this is out of the blue. Vaping saves lives. That's the harm reduction predicate there is built into that, right? Vaping saves lives. We have to reduce the harm. I find that lockdowns save lives and Vaping Saves Lives are incompatible positions, because one is about making sure individuals have liberty and in order for them to make the choices about what to do with their body. And then the other one is completely opposite that, where the government has said you don't have the right to do with your body. You don't have the right to put your body near somebody else's body. You don't have the right to take your body out of your house. You don't have you can't even be, within a certain distance of other bodies. I mean, it's just a complete, total a destruction of body control. So for me, I don't see how those issues could be compatible. Tough question, throwing it at you.
Well, I do actually think those things are totally different. It's the difference between a communicable and a non-communicable disease risk. With the coronavirus, an infectious disease, your behavior imposes risks on others. With something like vaping, your behavior doesn't really impose risks on anybody, but it essentially allows you to mitigate your own risks associated with smoking or taking nicotine. So that's the big difference to me. And if you go back to John Stuart Mill and the sort of harm principle, then you start to control the behavior of other people. The state intervenes to control the behavior of people when one person imposes a risk on another. And that, unfortunately, is a characteristic of communicable diseases or infectious diseases, not something to do with smoking, where it's much like leaving aside passive smoking, perhaps. So I think they are qualitatively different, and the measures that you can justify, and there are people that would say, well, if you really want to do public health, it's where, it's particularly global public health at the sort of WHO level, it's where you need an international, where you have potentially international coordination and collaboration failure. You need an agency to control the way these risks are transmitted from one person to another, from one group to another, across borders and so on. And that's very different to something like smoking or vaping. You don't close airports in order to reduce smoking risk. You don't lock people in their house to reduce smoking risk. But there is an argument. We've seen the effects of lockdowns have been effective in bringing down the infection and transmission rates associated with the infectious disease. They do work, but no such equivalent makes any sense when it comes to vaping. So I would see them as completely different things in that respect. It doesn't mean that bad decisions can't be made in both cases, but I don't think you can draw policy by analogy between the two.
So considering what the argument you just made, for, say, a global agency to deal with, pandemics and epidemics and so forth, shouldn't they be dealing with that and letting this thing about smoking, go away? I mean, maybe it's the smoking that should be taken out of WHO's hands.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good argument for that. If you were to do, let's do a zero-based review on WHO and look at what it has to do, then you would start with things like pandemics, control of infectious disease outbreaks, and so on. And then on top of that, I mean, the concept of the FCTC was the idea that governments needed to work together to overcome the kind of lobbying muscle and money of the tobacco industry. That the tobacco industry was just too powerful, and therefore you needed an entity at international level to normalize what good policy would look like, banning tobacco advertising, putting warnings on packs and so on. So the original concept of it was to try to normalize good policy. And, that's quite a common thing amongst international institutions to do that. It's what the World Bank and the IMF spend quite a lot of their time doing, for example. So it's not a completely illegitimate thing, but it would be more of a infectious disease readiness. But that's what the origin of the FCTC was. And if they were doing that, I wouldn't have so much kind of concern about it. Actually, generalizing good policy, not a bad idea. But what they're doing is generalizing really bad policy. And that is a problem.
Well, Clive, I mean, we've really, for one thing, I don't want to tempt the Skype fate anymore. So, you know, we've gotten through most of the interview, and I know I'll hear some stuff from our viewers going, some great bites were lost, but vast majority of what you said came through. So I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. And I mean, be safe out there. I never say the safe thing. I like to say, like, you know, keep up the fight, I think is the better one.
We're all right here.
All right. Well, thanks, Clive. Just hang tight right there for 1 second. And that is it for this edition of RegWatch. Before you head off, please go over to support.regulatorwatch.com and consider making a financial contribution to our vaping coverage. And of course, for all of our supporters out there, and you can see on our page who supports RegWatch, please spend some of your dollars, some of those government dollars that they're giving you. Go spend that on our supporters, because that really helps. And obviously, you'll be happy that you did it. And while online, don't forget to like us on Facebook and to follow us on Twitter. For RegulatorWatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.